of the Democratic Service is 217, 218. We are live stream, so what I would like you to do is if you're going to speak, is give your name, but speak through the mic, please. Right. And secondly, can you make sure your mobile phones are switched off? Right. The first item is to note the appointment of the chair. The second is to appoint a vice chair. I would like to appoint Tudor Thomas.
I'm happy to second that.
Thank you. You happy? Right. Can I take that as accepted then, please? Right, thank you. Well done. Welcome, Tudor. I'll try to make it as easy as possible for you. Right, number 3 is apologies for absence.
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from Councillors Francis Taylor, Peter Clark and Giles Howard.
Right. Thank you. Number 4 is declarations of interest. Do you want to do it as and when, as you go along the agenda? Number 5 is to the public forum. No? Number 6 is to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting. I know it's a while ago. And to be honest with you, none of us was here.
I was.
Basically.
So, do we accept them as read? Right. Number 7 is the Cabinet member to introduce property, and that's Paul Jordan, isn't it? And he's here somewhere.
Chair, can I just speak for a second, if that's okay? Yes, Councillor Jordan was due to come along today to address committee to set out some of his priorities for the new governance brief, the new portfolio that he holds. But I'm aware there's a pre-cabinet meeting this afternoon at 2 o'clock, which coincides with this. So, Chair, if committee agrees, I can, if you like, provide a little bit of an update in terms of the areas that we've started to scope out that might inform and shape the brief for the new governance portfolio, because I would imagine that's going to be of interest to members of this committee in particular, because there should be a direct relationship in terms of perhaps the work programme and some of the themes and priorities that you may choose to pursue. So would that be okay if I did that? Not in his absence, but perhaps I can just provide a little context, Chair.
Can I say then, I think that we need to be very careful now when we're inviting people to give a report, that there's not too much on, because there was planning inspection this morning, and then there was IT training as well, and now there's cabinet meeting, and we've got the democratic services. So I think it's trying to pile too much in one day.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I think that is a good point. I think in the first few weeks in particular for new members, there's been quite a lot crammed in, so we'll have much more regard to timing in the future. And I think me sort of setting some of this stuff out now doesn't negate Councillor Jordan coming back to committee just to introduce his portfolio. But just to give you a flavour of some of the things that we've been discussing. So at the moment, what we're trying to do as officers is just get some familiarisation overviews in terms of the new portfolio that comprises governance. So as you all know, that's legal, it's democracy and democratic services, elections, policy, performance, and data and scrutiny. So they're the substantive, thematic and service areas that sit within the governance brief. So obviously there's a great interest in legal and some of the capabilities and potential around our legal services. Again, it's, one of the things that's been looked at previously in a shared services regional context. So thinking about some of the potential really around growth of our legal function in the future. What opportunities are there around automation for some of the processes that we currently operate? Democracy, I won't say too much about that because there's a paper tabled for discussion today entitled New Directions in Democracy, again, which gives you an idea of some of the angles, I think, and some of the themes that the last committee was considering and whether some of those things are going to be of interest to this committee moving forward. Obviously, there's the whole scrutiny piece, which I think members have been inducted on. There's quite a lot to grapple with there. And again, I'm sure we'll be able to devote more time and consideration to that in the future. Elections, I think, again, one of the things I'll be talking about later on this afternoon is the local government white paper and some of the new directions that sets down quite clearly for democracy and democratic services and governance, in particular in the future. Then there's the whole bit around policy and improvement and performance, which Matt oversees, which also sits within that portfolio as well. So we're talking very much about data at the moment and the need to make sure that any future developments are very much evidence driven and led by key data insights and business intelligence. So they're just sort of areas that we've started to familiarise the cabinet member with at the moment, but within that I think there's clear potential to take some deeper dives and to investigate and explore some of the potential around those themes and issues to a much further degree. And I think we've started that today because on the agenda Matt's going to be taking us through the Our Monmouthshire, the Wellbeing Assessment findings, which will inform our wellbeing plan, and the paper that we've tabled as well on new directions in democracy. So it gives you a flavour of the cabinet portfolio and the scope and the breadth, but I think simultaneously some of the areas that you may wish to dig into and explore further as a committee.
Any questions? Oh, go on.
Can I just say, I think it would have been helpful. I understand the pressures Paul Jordan is under now in the Cabinet, but I think for this first meeting, it would have been useful if he could have been here to actually set the scene, particularly for somebody new like myself. I want to know the direction that we're going in. So I'm slightly disappointed this afternoon that we haven't had that, as it is the first meeting. And I think first meetings are always important, and I appreciate your input, and that's helped. But I think from a cabinet perspective, then I would want to know what is happening and where we're going in terms of general direction. I'm slightly disappointed that he's not here this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So to introduce myself, I'm Matthew Gatehouse, Policy and Performance Manager here at Monmouthshire, part of Kelly's department within the authority. What I'd like to share with you today is a few slides and some further information on the exercise we've undertaken to produce a wellbeing assessment for the authority. I'm just going to see if the slides come up. There we go, hold on. Just bear with me a moment. There we go. So just to give you a bit of context, I'm very conscious people here today are new members, and I appreciate some of you will have different levels of understanding of some of these issues, but if you just bear with me, I'll sort of run through some of the background in terms of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Now, you'll have a dedicated session on this, which I think is in the calendar for the 20th of June for those of you that are able to attend. But the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is a piece of legislation that was introduced in Wales last year. It came into effect on the on the 1st of April. And essentially it's about the process of improving the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, and of, for us, particularly of Monmouthshire. One of the expectations the Act places on us, and it places on the Public Service Board, Public Service Board being made up of all of the public services of the voluntary sector within the county of Monmouthshire, is to prepare a well-being plan for the area that looks far more longer term than you would normally think of public services looking, at least decadally, but ideally generationally. And the Act sets out a generation as being up to 25 years ahead. And this was a fairly groundbreaking piece of legislation. And at the time, the UN said, where Wales goes today, the world will follow tomorrow, in terms of the potential of this particular piece of legislation. And it places this responsibility to look long term, to produce a plan for the area, and to base that on what they refer to as a well-being assessment. And that assessment is sort of based on a mix of data, the quantitative information, the views of the people living within Monmouthshire and its communities, on academic research, and also on future trends. And it was about looking at the county as a whole, but also the communities that make up the county of Monmouthshire. And that would give us then the evidence base on which public services can base future decision making. So what we did for the purposes of this assessment was to look at Monmouthshire in terms of 5 communities. There's a lot of guidance underpinning this, and they're quite specific. It says don't go as low down as ward level. Don't go right down to ward level, because in a sense there's such a lot of detail there, and bear in mind this is being done for all 22 authorities in Wales. So we looked at what was sensible for Monmouthshire, and we clustered around the 5 largest towns in the area, with the area around sort of Usk and Raglan and the rural areas there, villages like sort of Linishan and Devorden being part of a sort of heart of Monmouthshire, a rural heartland of the county, and the other areas being around the towns and surrounding areas of Abergavenny, Monmouth, the Sevenside area, and also Chepstow and the Lower Wye. So before we get on to the findings, just to give you some sense of the evidence base for this. Over last summer, we went out and about and went to about 80 events on behalf of the Public Service Board, from groups of individuals and groups of people using services of different types, through to large events like the Usk Show. And just ask sort of fairly broad questions of people. What's good about where you live? And what would make it better? And we spoke with, I think the slide says 1,400. It actually went up on the final count, but something like sort of 1,700 people gave contributions to this. But bearing in mind, it wasn't a survey. These were conversations. And what we did then, we kind of went out with, which is very conscious. When you talk to people, often what you'll get is what's happened that morning. If someone has driven over a pothole or trod in something unpleasant on the way to the conversation, that may be the first thing you get. And that isn't necessarily going to give you the sort of evidence you need to start a conversation which is impactful and sets things out for future generations, the real sort of challenges. So what we did, we invested quite a bit in the look and feel of this, and we went out with a number of things, including these sort of postcards, which were facts and figures about the area, sorts of conversation openers. So I'll sort of pass these around so you get a bit of a sense, but things like flood risk score, things like obesity levels, house prices, earnings, the sorts of things that would start conversations and open up people's mindset a little bit. So it was all the evidence that normally the likes of myself and teams here at County Hall would sort of almost look at ourselves and bury ourselves away writing this without recourse to people. But we went out and said, well, this is what the data says. Is that your experience? And if not, tell us what your experience is. So we had these sort of supplementary blank postcards then, which we asked people to sort of pick up and say, tell us about Monmouthshire, tell us about your community, what makes it special? what could make it better, what would make it more sustainable. And that's where we used to sort of then gather all of these contributions, including going into schools, standing up in assemblies and giving sort of packs out to some classrooms where we're happy to engage, and getting all of that back. So we had one of the things that would make Monmouthshire better, which was my personal favourite, was more dinosaurs, please. But here, you ask a 4 and 5 year old a question, what they would like, but actually the process of people engaging was really important. And actually some of the things that people drew, I mean, you would of course see the differences as you'd expect through the age range before it gets up to the sort of usable text contributions. But actually some of the things you get from young people also been incredibly insightful. And I'll come on to the details, because we were going out with information where it said there were rising levels of obesity. Now, very few people said, I'm worried about obesity. But actually, a lot of people would come back and say, I'm concerned, do my children have access to the countryside? Are there places for them to go out and play and be active? So you put all of this evidence together and you start to see the trends and some of the issues that are coming through. So what we did, this is in the report as well, so I'm conscious you won't be able to see the detail on the screen there in terms of the font size. But because they're open conversations, we then went out and sort of clustered, applied some tags to the sorts of things that people were talking about in their county, and that sort of gives a representation of the sorts of issues that people were talking about. So landscape and countryside, really important for people in terms of how they valued place. Town centre and shops came out very strongly, but there were area differences, and in the full assessment, I've put a link into that in the report. You'll be able to see it. You can see the differences between the 5 areas. So, for example, shops and town centre were mentioned far more frequently in the area around Caldecott than they were in the area around Monmouth. In a sense, people see some of the challenges in terms of the vibrancy of the high street. If it's there, you could assume that sometimes people take that for granted and don't consider it to be as much of an issue. So we saw some real sort of differences there in the sort of issues coming through. But things like sense of community. Public transport came out quite strongly. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, if I may. We didn't go out with sort of questionnaires and say, fill in this monitoring form and tell us exactly how old you are and where you live. But it was on a sort of a voluntary basis. So there are some sort of charts there in terms of the rough spread of ages we spoke to. But you also see a lot of not stated, and that wasn't people saying, I don't want to tell you, but we didn't want to make this feel very formal. It was about a conversation. So some of the key things in terms of what the data and evidence was coming out through this assessment. An ageing population, a huge challenge for us in the county. Incredible benefits in terms of what that brings, but also some challenges. But the number of over 85s is due to, or the proportion I should say, increased by 186%, so more than doubling. And at the same time, we're seeing a reduction on the current trends of the number of under 18s. As a county, we've got property prices that are way above the UK average. Above the UK average, well above the Wales average, and that for neighbouring areas in southeast Wales. But actually the wages, the wages earned within the county for people that live and work here are below the UK level. And that was some of the sort of feedback that was coming through from all ages actually, in terms of the challenge of maintaining sustainable communities where house prices are high, wage levels are low, very difficult for young families to stay living and working in the area. And this wasn't just coming through from young people in their 20s and 30s. This was coming through from all generations, because grandparents were seeing families move away. And actually think of the potential effects of that on our health and social care system as social networks break up, as people have to leave the area. Linked into that, limited public transport. It came out strongly in the consultation, but also the data shows that for some of our communities, if you live in the very centre of Monmouthshire, the average journey time to your nearest leisure centre, to pick an example, and all right, you don't need a leisure centre to stay fit, but it's just an example of a local service, 2 hours and 17 if you're dependent on a bus. And that's an average. That's not an extreme, and this is nationally verified data. Now, of course, when you get into GP surgeries and other things, the journey time's less because they're that much more dispersed around the county, but a significant issue. Adverse childhood experiences. What happens to people? The sorts of things that young people are exposed to in the kind of almost what health professionals would term the first 1,000 days, from conception through to second birthday. Incredibly important, and there's a huge amount of evidence there from colleagues at Public Health Wales. And we know that the county is very prosperous and appears so, but we do have these pockets which are very, very different to what you may perceive when you just look at the headline measures. And also some of the issues coming through around the future. So, there's been a lot of talk about robotics and artificial intelligence in the news. Certainly, it seems almost every couple of days you're reading something about automation. And studies suggest that sort of over a third of current jobs in the UK could be replaced by automation. So thinking of the challenges of that on our communities and people coming through and seeking employment. So, Chair, I'm not quite at the end of the presentation, a little bit more around sort of what the challenges are, but I'm very conscious I've been speaking for a while. I wonder, with your permission, may I just pause at that point in case there are any questions or discussion points?
Yeah. Is there any questions from members or any concerns?
If not, I'm happy to carry on.
Shooter?
I wasn't born and brought up in this county, but I've lived here for something like 34 years, taught in Abergavenny in King Henry VIII for 12 many years ago. But the point that I would make is that you've got this huge dichotomy within the authority between obviously families and people who are very wealthy and affluent who can travel to the leisure centre in the family car or cars, who can make use of those sorts of services. And then you've got a huge swathe of families, and particularly young children and teenagers, who can't access, unless they live in somewhere like Abergavenny or Chepstow or Monmouth, where they can literally walk to the leisure centre and other facilities. And in my mind, there's almost this, almost like an unfairness. And certainly thinking of when I taught in the authority, you can go from somebody whose parents are doctors or teachers or consultants in Neville Hall to people who are in very low paid jobs, and who are living on some of the estates in sort of North Abergavenny behind King Henry VIII School, and where really they have very little stimulation, and where you have issues about obesity because they're eating cheaper foods which are bulky and fill them up because the budget doesn't stretch to that. And I just feel incredibly saddened that, being up in the estates now recently, things haven't changed from the 80s and 90s. And I think there's a huge responsibility on the authority to not just to have some fantastic plan where we've talked to people about various things, but we've got to do something about it in simplistic terms. I think most people across all parties would agree with that. And it isn't quite... In some respects, if you go to Blaen y Gwent and other areas and parts of Torfaen, then it isn't quite as stark. And obviously, if you look at the distribution, the demographic across the authority, you've got lots of people who work elsewhere but live in the authority in the county because of the fact it is a pleasant county, and they can access goods and services, and they can go further afield if they're not available. And I think, obviously, transport, affordable transport, I wasn't aware of that 2-hour, 17-minute window, which is quite bad. And also, I think in some of the country areas, there are lots of children and people who can't access goods and services to keep themselves fit, keep themselves from becoming obese, etc., because they can't get there, they can't access them. So I do think there's a huge responsibility on us all in this committee, but throughout the MCC, to actually do something about it and begin to address it, because in the long term, it will be more cost effective.
Thank you. Interesting that you mentioned about Caldecott and the town centre, because I'm from Caldecott. And yes, on the doorstep throughout the election, it was one of the main concerns that people had. I mean, we have a very active town team who are really trying to come up with inventive ways, but with the properties being owned by people outside of the county, there's also the great difficulty of how do you work in concert with that to try and get regeneration into the town. So I'm glad it all got raised and it's been carefully noted, and I do hope we can find some ways forwards for that.
Chair, I was just going to make a comment just in response to some of that. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, more than anything, this is about a call to action, not more policy or strategy. But where I do think that the work that Matt and the team has come in as really important is making sure that we're actually identifying the right problems. Because all too often we jump to solutions and we haven't really understood the scale of the challenge. So say, for example, you get these preconceived notions. When we had that statistic about 2.5 hours to a leisure centre, I thought, well, yeah, leisure centres are fine. We've got one in each of our 4 towns. But actually, our countryside is our 5th leisure centre. It's the biggest one. Should we be more worried about shipping people on a bus to a leisure centre or getting people to take advantage of their natural surroundings in ways that could enhance well-being? But actually, one of the findings we had back from the wellbeing assessment was people would love to access the areas surrounding them, but they're just not open or accessible. So I think what this does, you're absolutely right about your point, you've got to tackle the challenges. This has got to be about action and delivery, but we still need to make sure that we're tackling some of the right problems, because under the work that we're doing for Future Monmouthshire, travel and transport, community transport has been another big issue. And again, the answer to that, the solution might not be to jump straight to let's put more buses on the road. That might not be the right thing to do. The right thing to do is, do we maximise and optimise use of all the fleet, vehicles, the public services fleet that we have access to in the first instance? So it really makes you stop, doesn't it, Matt, I think, and ensure that we're really tackling the right problem and we've got the challenge fully understood. Because I think what this presents us with is an opportunity just to stop and just to make sure, rather than resort to the same old solutions and thinking we have the answers, it's to pause and deeply understand the issue and the problem in a very different way.
Thank you. I was very pleased when I heard about the consultation. I've been to events where I've received the postcards and talked to people. And I think to go in the right direction, you need to consult, you need to ask people. But at the end of the day, it's always very difficult to get people's views to be able to address any situation. They want to feel confident that their words are being, that they're being listened to, basically. And I think talking to town councils and community councils is a very, very important step in this process, because they are close to all the residents and their people in their wards, and they can offer ideas as to who to go and speak to, voluntary groups, organisations, and I think that would be something worth considering along. But as I say, consultation and asking people what they want is the right way to do it, but you've got to do it at a very, very at a level where people are talking to their constituents, and I feel strongly about that. I mean, I know we've got a lot of voluntary groups, for example, in Abergavenny, and there are people in those groups that can give you an awful lot of information, but to go out and talk to the people who go to the community centres and the leisure centres, I know it's not easy, but it's the right, you're going in the right direction asking people, but don't forget your town and community councils.
No, thank you. And I think that's a very valid point, actually. And I think probably one, because we're doing this for the first time, and I think that was one of the learning points, really. If we repeat this again, probably one of the things we would do is spend more time in those community and town councils, because we had, we wrote to people. We wrote to the clerks of all the town councils and sort of extended the offer to come out and talk. But actually, they're dealing with a lot of correspondence, and perhaps if we'd been a little sort of vociferous and almost sort of turned up knocking at the door on a few occasions to push ourselves up up the agenda, because there were a number of occasions we had some really, really good involvement through from community councils, and actually one of the community councils went out and actually dropped all of the houses in his area seeking contributions to this exercise, and sort of gathered them all and sent them all back in an envelope, which was incredible for us, and you know, gave a really sort of rich vein of evidence.
Yeah, I think one of the huge problems when you're trying to find out what people actually want and how they think, I don't envy you in your challenge, because I think it's very difficult. And let's be honest, lots of people, myself included, if I wanted to put my viewpoint across, I'm in a position to do it. I'm not lacking in confidence to write to people, to speak to people, to complain, if I'm unhappy with things. But I think going across the county, my living experience, if you like, is mainly in North Monmouthshire. And going down, for things like the Count in Chepstow, I thought, when did I last go to Chepstow? Nothing really would make me want to come, and perhaps people in Chepstow might not come to Abergavenny. But going back to this thing of finding out people's views, lots of people are not so confident in telling, as they see it, officialdom, what they think, and for somebody, the man in the grey suit or whatever, to them is officialdom, and they would be overfaced by that. And I think if you look at schools, and that's my main experience, but lots of people who didn't do so well in school, when their children go to school, they're not confident to speak to the professionals, to speak to the head teacher, the class teachers. Why isn't my Johnny doing so well at Key Stage 3, or what happened about Key Stage 2? And I think you're going to have to think sort of creatively. And I don't disagree with Councillor Woodhouse. I think it is good to speak to the community and things like town councils. But really, you've got the fairly slanted view there, because so many people don't get involved with that layer of local democracy. Because again, you need an element of confidence, commitment, time to be able to do that. And I think one of the big hurdles that MCC have as an authority is actually finding out what people want and desire, rather than thinking, well, yes, this is what they want. Let's put a few more buses on the road, etc. And if you look at something like Abergavenny, you haven't got a bad sort of bus service, actually. You're going around the estates. It's quite cheap, relatively. But people don't move much from their area. You say you go to that North Abergavenny, you look at the ACE Centre, which is financially struggling now. There's a lot of good work. Park Street Community Centre is doing a lot of good work getting people in. But people won't or aren't able to, to move to those centres. So I think you're going to really have to sort of think hard in terms of not just finding out the people who are vociferous and can put their point of view forward, but the people who are more reticent, who are a little bit afraid of the authority in a sense, and think, well, I don't want to draw too much attention here, because they're worried about it, and I think that's a huge challenge that you have with this particular aspect, and it is incredibly important. And you can have as many stats as you want, but sometimes I think you can come up with the wrong answer. And I don't mean you personally. I think in any organisation, it's very difficult to get to a sort of a via media to see, well, yeah, this is what will benefit most people. This will be a good thing in terms of, say, health, levels of good health, decreased levels of obesity, etc., etc.
Yeah, and it's a very good point, actually, and we were very careful when going out, because I actually get the point about sort of the grey suit, and we all know, and this isn't necessarily right, that depending where we are and how we're dressed and how we project ourselves in different situations, you get a different level of engagement. So anecdotally, I know if I go in the same place in a suit and tie, where I get called sir, if I go in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, I get called mate. And So actually, when we're out and about and doing shows and going certain places, when you stood outside Tesco on a Thursday afternoon, as a lot of the team were, actually it's about being dressed in a way and with a demeanour that makes you approachable. So not being stood there with the tie and the clipboard, but actually sort of sometimes having the postcards and having the things that keeps the children occupied where you can talk to the adults, because if you keep the kids happy for 2 or 3 minutes, then you've got a chance of a conversation. And at the same time, you might get something really useful from the young people. But
I'm sorry, Matt, I was just going to add that I think the real benefit of this approach, it wasn't kind of big council public meetings, was it, with officers at the front doing car crash PowerPoint presentations, listen to us, you sit in the audience. If it took hanging around outside Wetherspoons or the job centre, that's where people were at. But I totally take your point about the usual suspects and the loudest voices, because when you move to more formal methods of engagement, you always tend to get that, don't you? The people that can project and shout the loudest. And I think for going forward, this has got to be a core tenet of our work around social justice, which is Councillor Jones's new brief. And I believe she's making contact to go out and around with members over the coming weeks and months. So it's certainly something that we have to embed in practice consistently. But our head of comms was telling me earlier that we've got quite formal processes in place for complaints. When people make complaints, they get escalated, they write to us. After 3 times, it becomes a formal investigation. And she was saying, actually, all the complaint activity is on Facebook. Somebody will say the council's rubbish. The next thing you know, you've got 100 people saying the council's. That's where we need to be at to make sure that we are, obviously conveying views directly in response to what people are telling us, but making sure that we are where the action is at. It isn't always through a formal complaint process that you have to wait 28 days to turn up in the mailbag. It's where people want to communicate informally, where they get sort of other public opinion, and that thing tends to sort of build up quite quickly, doesn't it? So we've got to think about and they're not new formats. I mean, Facebook has been with us for 10-15 years, but it's just making sure as part of our psyche and everyday processes, we're there where the people are at. I think it's as simple as that, really, isn't it?
Sorry to hog this, but one thing I would say, I totally agree with you. Things like Facebook, if you look at the demography on Facebook now, the age is going up quite substantially. Lots of young people have got out of it because it's the old boring. Well, that's right. It's the old boring people like me that go on it. I've been told off for this by my kids, but I totally agree with you. And the one thing I would say is that I think the survey that you did from current elected members is important, because actually going out on the door, as all of us have done in our different areas, I think has probably thrown up things that I hadn't thought of before. I have filled the survey in, so I can get a little tick for that now. But the point is, I think in that context, people are much more ready to speak to you on the door. And okay, people might want to have a go at you depending on which party they're supporting. But apart from that, people will, my experience, most people were polite and did raise issues, and they weren't just the normal things of litter, dog mess, etc. And things like, particularly in Abergavenny, it's use of Bailey Park, people with young kids, older people trying to keep fit, etc. All those sorts of things were coming up quite regularly, and I think that's a good way of doing it. I know it's more difficult, for as it were, paid officials of MCC to do that, but I think you've got to have a sort of a shopping bag with different ways of saying, well, yeah, let's find out that, or let's take that temperature of how people are feeling. Let's look at Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and then try to get to somewhere where you're reaching a decision which will suit most people, because you're not going to suit everybody.
Can I just make one point about the survey that Councillor Thomas has just mentioned? At scrutiny training, I did ask if all councillors could be made available for all councillors to see. Obviously it's going to be put to good use, but that would be useful for all of us at this stage to see what's happening in other wards and give us ideas to take forward.
Chair, if I could, I think that's an excellent idea, and I think that was the whole point of getting all of that intelligence that you received on the doorstep when you were canvassing, so that isn't lost, because I think, as Paul said on day one, that's probably the most up-to-date insight that we have, so that is very, very important. But just to say, in terms of acquainting yourself with the county, I know we've arranged a members bus tour, I think for the end of June, just to get you out into those different areas and the different wards and to see some of the issues. It isn't a planning bus tour, it isn't to take you to see strategic sites or anything, you know, malevolent like that or underhand. It is just to get you acquainted, because the county is vast, isn't it? There are lots of different areas with lots of different issues. And I just think it is important for context's sake. You know, you get that exposure and you get to see that, especially through another member's eyes. I think that's really important.
So, last couple of slides. And if I just get this one back. Here we go. So we used all of this evidence, and you know, as Kelly mentioned, it was really important, and I think this is where the discussion is taking us, really, to fully understand some of the challenges and opportunities out there. So the closing section of the assessment, you'll see the detail is appended to the report, where you see the challenges and opportunities identified, and that's what's up on the screen here. So I won't sort of run through them verbatim, but what I actually did then was turn all of that into some statements that would allow us then to consider that in future planning. And bearing in mind, this is not just for Monmouthshire County Council. And thinking about that out and about, one thing you'll notice as you look at any of this publicity, you won't see Monmouthshire County Council on it anywhere. We didn't try and go out and be officers of the council. We were out there on behalf of public services and studiously tried to avoid the question of who we worked for, because that can skew the conversations that you have. So we've surfaced these challenges, and at the moment, the council has signed off well-being objectives for the council as a body. Now, that was prior to the election, so obviously there'll be an opportunity to revisit that. The Public Service Board are currently working through these challenges to identify where the PSB as a whole needs to address its energy, where do public services need to come together to solve some of these issues that perhaps are so complex they can't be solved by any single individual body working in isolation. But regardless of which of those end up as the PSB wellbeing objectives or the Public Service Board priorities, all of those issues remain incredibly important. And I think all of that comes into the mix in terms of the sorts of issues you've gathered from the doorstep, from surveys, some of the other evidence we're getting through now from the Future Monmouthshire programme. And I guess really what we're talking about is thinking about how all of this analysis used together can help us surface some organisation and business impact that which the organisation can start to take action on over the course of this next five years for which you'll be serving as councillors. So there are sort of a couple of elements to the recommendations, and again, happy if you want to explore any of the issues, but just thinking of, firstly that point of bringing all of this together to give us the insight on the county, and then identifying where the gaps are. So I think Councillor Woodhouse's point earlier, those surveys and the point Councillor Taylor made, really important to us in terms of gathering all of this information in the round. But also considering what learning we can take from the way in which we produce this assessment to help in terms of shaping a more participative approach to democracy. Because we know, as has been discussed, people won't necessarily engage with a middle-aged man in a grey suit, but actually they might engage with different people, they might engage digitally, they might engage with a youth worker. So how is it how can we best step in away from that purely representative form of democracy to something that is more participative in nature, where people feel able to come forward and share their views of how things are, but also to help and work and co-produce with us some of the solutions for the future of the county.
No? Right, if that's the case, then thank you, Matt. And I hope you come back with some further evidence. And when you go out next time, don't put shorts on, just put slacks and casual on. Because I'll be honest with you, what you're saying and what's been said is correct. Because I've noticed the way when Momish housing are going out on the estates, they don't go dressed up; they go casual, and they do get a good attendance. And I think it's a page of their book which we should be looking at. Right, thank you. Can we go on to item 9 now? Discussion items and papers on the new direction of democratic. You taking that, Kelly?
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Chair. Okay, members, this was a paper that I put together towards the end of the last administration, which was requested by the 16-17 Democratic Services Committee. And I think really born out of a desire to sort of reinvigorate the agenda and start to understand really what were new directions and fresh perspectives in democratic development all about, what new ideas, what great practice was out there that we could really look to and learn from. So at the last meeting, we brought a presentation to the committee on something called collective impact. And very simply, what that is I suppose in this new world where we face, I can't even tell you how many challenges and problems, whether they be social, economic, demographic, technological, and so on. How do we engage that creative component of communities? Not just the reactive bit, not just the bit when we turn up at town and community councils and say, do you want to take on the street sweeper or the grass cutter? How can we really get communities to understand the problems that collectively we need to solve? And more than that, how can we engage them in that problem-solving process? They have deeper insights than us. They live these lives. So how can we take the best from community and unlock some of that people power in a really purposeful way? And I think it goes back to the point that Councillor Thomas was making. How do we get those characteristics, a very small group democratic engagement, into a process and a structure that's really built on quite large scale, sort of larger transactional movement? So how do we get that balance right, where we're doing the face-to-face stuff, but obviously we're dealing with the larger structural stuff as well? And I think, when you're part of local government, a phrase that you'll hear quite a lot is good governance. And I think we've got to get beyond talking about that to really understanding what it means for our communities, not just now, but as Matt has said, in the future. That's clearly key, isn't it, with developments and their pace. So as a background to this, a statutory requirement now is placed upon us to look ahead with the well-being of future generations. It's not good enough, and neither should it be, just to think about today's issues. We've got to keep one eye on tomorrow. So what's our capacity for strategic foresight and thinking ahead? Matt's talked about the well-being assessment and some of the rich data and evidence that we've got from that. And I think as well the timing's right in terms of us having a new administration. There's a new term, you are a new Democratic Services Committee. So how do you wish to sort of set your stall out in terms of the areas and the priorities that you want to alight upon and explore further? And I think for us as officers as well, there's a real opportunity to think about how we align and connect improvement and performance of our council with real meaningful citizen engagement. Because I think all of the good data and the evidence that we've got, yes, it needs context, yes, it needs interpretation, but what it's telling us is what matters, and they're the things that we should be really carving out our future around. So we need to be relevant, we need to be efficient, we need to be responsive. All of that stuff is inescapable. But I think the key question that this paper poses is how do we improve the democratic character and quality of our organisation so we get to much better, much more productive two-way public debate. Now there's lots of different ways and means that we can explore around that, and this paper just tries to set out some of those to stimulate a discussion and a conversation about what the future could look like. And I thought it was a good time because, as you stated already, you're fresh from the doorstep. In fact, that we're coming into another election in a few days, so all of that rich insight needs to be captured, not just by way of a survey, and we all recognise the findings, but what does it mean in terms of how that informs and shapes, democratic engagement ongoing? There's got to be some bigger messages that we take from that. So we've had a look around, and of course there's lots going on in different places, no one size fits all. There's lots of evidence and data sets and case studies out there. And what I was finding when I was doing some of this desktop research is there's a lot of evidence to tell us how to run democratic services functions, you know, sending out agendas, how we minute meetings. But that isn't the essence of democracy. You know, democracy has a much more purposeful meaning than that. So I was really struggling to find examples of places of local authorities who've actually repurposed and refreshed what they mean by democracy, which I suppose, you know, sends some key messages in itself. Had a look at the Open Government Network, as I've cited in the report, and what they do is try and support and encourage different groups, individuals, organisations who want to work with government in different ways, who want to increase transparency, who want to open up decision making, get more people to participate in ways that suit them, and to drive that need for real accountability. So the network collaborates with, but also challenges government to think about being a bit more ambitious and enterprising in this area of its work. And what I've done was just set out some findings which I thought were really interesting. So the Open Government Network have set out, you know, the core issues of democratic engagement that they're asked to work and focus on. So some of it goes from being really basic things that residents want. You know, how do you navigate a council website? You know, how do you report issues and problems? You know, how do you really sort of orientate yourself around this big system which is local government? But some of it was about the changing role of elected representatives as well. You know, with more information being available, you know, 24/7 on websites, on apps, on Twitter, Facebook, what is the contemporary role for councillors in this day and age? How do they work much closer with the electorate? And I found some great examples of before council meetings where big decisions were coming up that were affecting certain communities, of the local member having, you know, very local meetings to get and to gauge that strength of opinion. You know, great examples of when it came to election time, you know, local people were able to access their local members' voting record so they could see, you know, how they had voted on certain matters that were of importance to them. So, you know, some quite diverse ways and means out there which I thought were really interesting. Quite a big focus on training and support for county councillors to adapt to this changing context and sort of new ways of engaging. Empowering councillors to seek out new forms of engagement as well, as I've been talking about, prior to big decision making. Lots around openness, open government and open data, you know, making data available, understanding what it is that local people need to be able to help us to solve and overcome problems. What is it they need to access? And we've had some really good examples where we've opened up our data and we've got some, you know, really interesting and different perspectives in beyond what we would have if we'd have kept that data to ourselves and thought that it was just our job to recognise and to solve problems. Scrutiny, there's quite a lot of information on the Open Government Network about new ways in which they've taken forward scrutiny. And I think I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, you know, in all the years that I've chaired this scrutiny committee, I can remember us having public attendance in the public open forum 3 or 4 times. You know, is that good enough for what we're trying to achieve? How do we open that up? Should we just expect that people would come along to, you know, an open forum and sit in the back and trot down the front and ask their question and then leave? You know, is that really what we're trying to get at and to achieve? And I think as well, it's about impact, isn't it? You know, it's about, yes, having conversations about the issues that affect people's lives today. But I think as the Our Monmouthshire process has shown to us, people are really concerned with the future, about their kids, about their grandkids, future generations. How will they access housing? What kinds of jobs, employment are there for them locally? And how can they engage in these new economies and industries of the future? I looked more broadly. There was some stuff, more conventional stuff, citizens panels. They're still working in some areas. One local authority I looked at had 1,000 people coming together at various points in the year as a citizen panel. So when there were big planning issues or whatever, it was just a way of getting quite large-scale involvement, community involvement in specific issues. There's a lot of work by Nesta on this as well, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and arts. So they were looking at local problems being best solved through local social public action. So, governmental bodies sharing some of the big challenges and asking people to come forward with what they thought the big solutions of the day were, and understanding what people really needed to be able to formulate and to establish some of those solutions. So that was seen as really renewing the democratic mandate in some communities who'd merely been consulted in the past and not really properly engaged. And, Matt has talked about the Our Monmouthshire work. Well, to sort of complement that, we've got a platform called Made Open, Matt. I don't know if you just want to explain what that is, because I think that's quite interesting in terms of some of your points about digital engagement as well, because, increasingly there's a real drive and need for that, isn't there?
I can't believe I forgot to mention this. I did refer to it in my paper. I normally don't miss an opportunity to plug Monmouthshire Made Open. This is something we've invested in for a couple of years now. So it's a digital engagement platform. It's almost a social network for social good is how we like to term it. And people can go on there. Again, it doesn't look like a council thing. You won't see Monmouthshire Council sort of referenced in any of it. But actually people can go on there and raise issues in their community and invite other people to help shape solutions. So you can say, actually, not happy with the way this is at the moment, anyone got any ideas? So unlike Facebook, which can sometimes be an echo chamber for people just sharing and resharing views, there's a point at which on Made Open you can say, let's turn this into a project. And it's linked into a crowdfunding module. If people are familiar with crowdfunding, where you can sort of donate small amounts of money. You can also ask for volunteers or for resources. So you can say, well, we'd like to, the end of our road, we'd like to do something with that. Go on Monmouthshire Made Open. Well, I need a bookkeeper to get a bit of funding in, and I need someone with a lawnmower to cut the grass, and I need someone to stand at the edge of the street and just, make sure no kids are going to cycle past with a bike while we're trimming the hedge. Whatever it might be. You can ask for those resources, and that's a very small local issue, and throw it out there and seek volunteers. So it's one way in which people are able to surface those challenges and ask others to get involved in helping solve and take action. So we've had it running for a couple of years. We work with some people down in Cornwall to help us develop it. And interesting now, it's been taken up in Australia, where it's been adopted in Tasmania. It's been bought by one of the neighbouring metropolitan councils in England who haven't launched yet, so we can't name them. A couple of other organisations in there over the border in England. So we've yet to see the full benefits of this in Monmouthshire, but actually we believe that in terms of this more participative approach to democracy and local services, there really is some mileage in sticking with this sort of solution. And also, it's a place to maintain the energy. Some people will go to public meetings, some won't. But if you do, how do you maintain the energy once those plastic chairs have been folded away at the end of the evening? What about the person that sort of sat on their hands, desperate to talk, but was too embarrassed to put their hand up in front of 50 people? So you can sort of just go on in the background and make your contribution and keep that energy going once those plastic chairs have been folded away.
So I know the town teams have used it quite extensively, for example, in both Abergavenny and Caldecott. With the events that we've got on at Caldecott Castle as another example over the summer, that's where we really crowdsource volunteers and local contributions. So it's been tremendously successful, but I think we haven't really optimised its uses and purpose, which is, I think, part and parcel of some of the dilemmas and conundrums that we want to position with you this afternoon. We've also got an app called My Monmouthshire, which allows people to engage with us online, to pay bills, to access services, to have their say. I was told this morning we've got now 20,000 active users, which is over a quarter of our population. But that has to evolve as well, because at the moment there's a place where you can report problems on the app. And there's always going to be a need to report some problems. We want to get away from this mindset of the council fixes people, we can solve your problems. The idea is that together we must solve problems, because local social action is the only way to sustainably resolve some of these matters, especially in a context where our resources are declining very, very significantly. So we've made some progress, but I think, you know, the message is there's further to go, which is why we wanted to position this paper this afternoon. You'll see some of these messages reflected in the local government white paper, and when I ran that policy seminar for new members a few weeks ago, we talked about this in some detail. So as Councillor Woodhouse has said, there's a big focus on how councils can reconnect with town and community councils. You know, is the relationship, is that place-based approach as good as it could be? You know, I think that's a key question for us to ask in terms of some of our relationships. Is there more potential and room for civic engagement in how we set budgets? You know, sort of more participative democracy in how we go about budget setting. Lots of questions about how digital some of our services are. If they were increasingly digitised, would we have further reach and scope? So I think, again, some key questions there. Remote attendance at meetings is now being mooted in that local government white paper, you know, not just digital voting and some of those issues around elections, but remote attendance. So how councillors are actually going to be more accountable to their electorate in terms of annual reports, making yourself available above and beyond local surgeries, but how you're going to have that interaction and give that feedback, that feed forward to your electorate. So how clear do we make the ways in which residents and constituents can actually engage with you? How do we open up those key channels? Area committees, and again, you know, we reviewed those fairly extensively here, but they're not the be-all and end-all of kind of local democracy and governance. So I think there's much further for us to go. And the white paper as well also talks about revisions to electoral arrangements around postal voting, electronic voting, counting, voting outside of polling stations, and the development of a single electronic register for Wales as well, which could be, you know, quite exciting, and I think is worthy of consideration in this context as well. So the collective impact stuff Matt has talked about, and again, you know, that's how do we engage with communities. So together we're solving problems. You all know our budget situation. It's the same across Wales, felt particularly acutely here because we are currently the second lowest funded council in Wales. So in light of all the challenges that we face, you know, strategic and local, how do we work with our communities to unlock, you know, some of the skills, talent, ideas, resources, the capital that they have that could help us overcome some of these significant challenges? So that innovative partner power, you know, harnessing all of those skills, resources, ideas that are available towards us that could lead to change. And I think, as Matt has rightly identified, the Public Service Board, the wider public service family, has a key role to play in this as well. I think, I mean, the point that we're always really keen to impress as well is that Monmouthshire has a paid workforce of 4,000 individuals, but we have an off-payroll workforce, if you like, of 90,000 residents. You know, what part can they play in helping with some of these big challenges and problems? How do we unlock some of that talent? How do we enable communities to connect with one another as well as us as well? So, you know, we've been looking at lots of different methods through Future Monmouthshire of how we create value in the future. One of the things that we do at the moment when we're procuring goods and services is we have a tender brief and we stick that out to the market and we say, right, this is the solution we want to buy in. What price can you give us? Well, in the future, I think that's going to change. I think instead of putting out there what we think the solution is, we'll be telling people our problems and asking them to come up with the right solutions for us. And we've started to look at that already through procurement, through our open data. You know, there have to be better ways of doing these things. And I think that agenda around openness and being more data-driven is key to unlocking some of that. So the big vendors who always try and sell us products, you know, they don't have the answers. You know, it's probably local people and people who understand the problems that we face, you know, that can help us. So it's called co-creation, isn't it? That's the kind of the nomenclature around this. But, you know, for us, it's just collective impact and working together with our communities to really harness their best. I mentioned community governance, and for you as new members, important for you to understand where we are with that. Last year, the Cabinet commissioned a review of community governance, which was basically focused on area committees and some of the new structures that had been brought into being. So things like town teams and some of the programme boards that had started to establish at a local area. So our review really found that no one size fits all, and what we really needed to do was to let local areas get on with it, to get on with the structures and the systems that really suited them the best. So Abergavenny's gone one way, Sevenside is the other pilot area, has gone in a slightly different way. They both still have retained their area committees, but have, you know, slightly different approaches to how they bring all the relevant stakeholders together. And I think, well, whilst that sorted out area committees in one way, you know, area governance goes far beyond that. So what we've got to do is keep pushing, and we've got to keep understanding the potential, really, to create the right structures and systems for governance that not just are about the loudest, more vocal people, you know, to give as many people as possible the voice through as many different mechanisms as possible. So just to summarise all of that, and where I think, you know, it leaves you as a committee and some of the questions and some of the areas that you may want to focus on in the future. So you're a new committee, you've got a new mandate, and yes, I suppose this is an overhang from the previous committee, but I think it poses some pretty fundamental questions about the future and how we can improve and enhance the process of democratic engagement. You've heard about the wellbeing assessment and the objectives and the wellbeing plan or strategy that we will soon craft. And I think, you know, really what I'm trying to gauge is your area, your interest in this area. You know, what are the different themes and priorities that you would like to focus on? What are the different actions and the areas of progress that you're most interested in focusing on? How can they be demonstrated and measured? Obviously, democracy goes just beyond political advocacy and the system of voting and protecting all of our civil liberties. I mean, fundamentally, democracy is just about creating the capacity to do things, isn't it? It's as simple as that, really. And I think, so together, you know, we have to think about the important problems that we want to work on and think about the most productive ways in which we could begin to solve those. So in light of the growing challenges that are faced by our county and are indeed upon us already, how do we get more people engaged and involved so that together we can make a key difference? So I think, you know, that is the proposition to you as a committee. And I'd be really interested in hearing some of your thoughts and opinions, because I think those thoughts and opinions can help us shape a work programme. So as your officers, you know, we can get the evidence, the data, we can seek the best practice, we can find out what our neighbours are doing. But, you know, together we really have to understand the approach that we want to drive.
Thank you. Thank you, Kerry. That was a very in-depth report. If any of you got any questions to Kerry? Yes.
Hi. It's quite interesting that you mentioned about how comfortable are the public coming to a setting like this to actually engage. For the last 7 years, I've been on Monmouthshire's SACRA. And SACRA is never in a televised room, or at least the ones I haven't been to recently like this. And we have a lovely open circular table, and as a faith representative, which I was in those times, it was quite relaxed. I just sat amongst people. I didn't know who was counsellors, who was teachers, who was other faith reps. And it was a very comfortable environment to be in as a faith representative. So I was actually always felt quite at home and able to put forward any views that I felt just as an ordinary member of the public. I suspect, had I been sitting in this chamber over here with people over there, I commented to Tudor and I just happened to comment, kind of, this is quite adversarial. This isn't a comfortable bringing the community together to discuss and find ways to have solutions together. So if we actually want the public in these sorts of meetings, we probably need to think about how we sit them out.
I don't disagree with you at all. The other thing is, I think we got to go over to the public. It's not a closed shop. You know, because people come here, or they won't come here, because they think it's a closed shop.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, isn't it? And even though, you know, there has to be an element of formality, and this is live stream so people can access it, you know, do people are people interested in listening to this kind of debate? You know, are the conversations that you mentioned, Matt, on the street corners, are they more enriching? So yes, we've got to do some of this, haven't we? Because, you know, we're bound by some of these structures. We have to be open. It has to be live stream. But what else can we do to really add value? You know, is it going to mean this committee sort of getting out there, you know, putting ourselves in different, unusual contexts? You know, I'm open to ideas, really, in terms of, you know, how we can not shake this up, because I think there's plenty of different ways and means. But if we are going to hold good to some of the things that we're talking about in terms of true democratic representation, what else could we be doing that really adds value, that makes people feel engaged, that makes people feel like, yes, this is worth being part of, it's worth lending my voice and opinion because something happens as a result of it? And I think that's the key point, isn't it? How does this lead to actionable change?
I'd agree with what my councillor on the left here has said, and I think obviously this sort of setting is very formal, isn't it? And with the use of you know, the mic, etc., and being live streamed. I do think we've got to think of less formal ways of gaining public opinion. When I say I go back to the election, thing of knocking on somebody's door and then listening, you know, to not complaints, but having a dialogue with people of things that are important to them. And I think it's important sometimes when you realise, if you look at someone like Abergavenny, where like any town, you have sort of an element of antisocial behaviour. But when you speak to a woman who's got 2 or 3 young kids right on the edge of the Fairfield car park, lives there, wants to get them to bed, she wants them to go to school in the morning refreshed and ready to learn, etc. But all jokes aside, when you actually get somebody telling you that, then it does have quite an impact, because you realise, but if you've had young kids yourself, you know what it's like to try to get them to bed so that you can have a bit of time to have a cup of coffee or whatever. But that sort of engagement is so important, and I think one of the difficulties which I don't have in Priory and Abergavenny, but if you go into a rural area, is the communities are so widely scattered, and lots of people living in rural areas will say, well, I haven't seen the local councillor or candidate, or haven't seen the parliamentary candidate, because they're in a village or a hamlet of 20-30 houses, or they're up a lane, etc. And I think perhaps sometimes you should think of things like coffee mornings in wherever, where people turn up not too formally clad and with clipboards, etc., but just speak to people to find out really what they're thinking, and to try and sort of drop that barrier, really. And I quite honestly, I do think it's a very difficult task that we have and you have to actually do that. And certainly for younger people, what saddened me when I was out canvassing with a number of people below, say, 30 or 40 years of age, who plainly said they were not going to vote. What's it got to do with me? It'll be exactly the same. If I go there and vote, for whatever party or for whatever person after the election, it won't make a jot of difference to my lifestyle or my kids, etc. And obviously I try to persuade them differently in terms of voting, of exercising a right is important regardless of which party you support, but taking part in the process. And I think we've got to think about ways, and you said about things like electronic voting, lots of younger people would probably readily vote in that way. If you look at the demography, people over 65, 99% of them vote, either postally or they go to the polling station, but they do vote. But if you look at the age group 30 down, then you have far less participation. And yet, when you think about it, people in that age range have got, statistically, have got a much longer time to live, and they've probably got young kids in school, and they've got to think of careers, etc. Not that I'm saying that you shouldn't take the views of older people, myself included, but people of my age group and above will make our views known generally, will take part in the democratic process, but it takes a bit of time and effort. And sometimes people say, I'm too busy. I've got my childcare issues. I've got my work. I've got to clean the house, you know, etc., etc. And it's quite difficult to break down through that. So, I think we've got to think about ways. And, I like what you've done already. I'm not in any way criticising that. I think it's good. But I don't know if you've gone far enough to involve people across sort of a socio-economic range, an age range, where people live. You've got different interests. You're in the country as opposed to the town. So, I think we've got to look at it quite broadly.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, actually, especially when you talk about the issue of voting. Very conscious that over the last couple of weeks, because my children watch Britain's Got Talent on television. And they're 8 and 11, and they have no concept or care who Jeremy Corbyn or Theresa May or Leanne Wood are. But actually, they're quite interested in picking up the phone at an extortionate rate and voting for someone that's singing a song on the television. And actually, it's thinking, how do we make our own institutions and also our own local projects as accessible and interesting to young people? One of the things we spoke about at the Future Monmouthshire group is how you break some of these big challenges down into the level at which people can understand. Because if you talk about the local environment, people might nod and say, oh, yeah, local environment, and then you might say, well, Usk in Bloom, and suddenly you get people's ear a little bit, and then you say, could you plant some bulbs at the bottom of your garden? So you go from what that big challenge, and you break that down at the level at which it means something to those communities and those individuals, and how we can engage them. And in a sense, I think that's some of the advantages, but also the challenges we will have with a localism agenda, is how we respond to that and make all of this accessible at a local level, in chunks which people can actively engage with it. Because we know that no one's going to come forward and volunteer to deliver a public service for us, but actually they will give their time to build better communities. And if we can find the right way to incentivise that and the right way to involve people, we have, out there we know more people in Monmouthshire volunteer than in any other county in Wales. There's a lot of social capital, there's a huge amount of goodwill. And the potential to capitalise on some of that for us all to sort of pull in the same direction, if we can get those messages and that packaging right.
Yes.
Can I just add, the consultation you've done, I think, is fantastic. You've gone out to events. Obviously, there's a lot of historic information that you've got about consultations in the past. Communication is so important, and it's not easy to get the right message over. But I'm just sitting here thinking again about local representation. If you could get this message at this time out to the local, councils, and they, we've got councils involved in lots of different organisations, and ask them specifically to take back the message that's coming over loud and clear, that you want to know how people how they would become involved, what would the incentive be for them to get involved, and just how really keen you are for this to happen. Always have been, I know, but it's not easy, and times change, communications are different now to they were 10 years ago, means of communication. This is obviously happening within all councils. This best practice can be shared between councils. If we can sort of tap into that, I know you probably do consult and meet representatives from other councils, but I'm always aware that you don't want to reinvent the wheel. If somebody's doing something particularly good in another council, that we can share, and vice versa. But it's about good communication, and that is always a very, very difficult subject. But if you can take small steps, sometimes that can open up a whole new area. It's the same with all organisations, getting people involved, getting people to want to speak. It's not an easy one, but you are trying very hard, and that's recognised. And I think if the local councils, community councils can take this on as well and feedback, they can get out there in their voluntary roles, in all the things they're involved in, and spread the word.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said there, Councillor Woodhouse. And I think the difficulty that we have at the moment is with things like our Monmouthshire. We're going out and we're asking big, open questions about anything really, about what matters. I think where we'll really start to see some interesting movements and changes, as we always do, is when we go out to do things like revise our local development plan. Now, having been through that process, and the scars are still fresh on my back, I mean, that is fascinating, because as soon as you start talking about building new houses, you find you go to public meetings where you have hundreds, and in fact we had them in our last county hall. You have meetings where you get nearly 1,000 people turning up, and you know, the vast proportion of those people don't want new housing. But we've got to think about, how do we get to the voices of the 4,000 plus people on our housing register who desperately in need of housing, who won't turn up at big meetings like that and be shouty, because again, that, you know, sometimes the loudest voices, and some of them have good reason, but you know, again, it's about balance. So I think at the moment we're in a place where we're asking big questions, and housing is one of the issues that's come back as, you know, a resounding problem. We don't have enough housing, but then when we focus in on that issue very much at a local level, and you get that potential for deeper engagement, I think that's when we'll see some of the more fascinating dynamics play through, and that's where I think we've really got the chance to try and do things differently and invert the typical perspective of the ones who don't want it to turn up, but the ones that do, you know, have to be quiet. You know, I think that's when we'll see some real potential. I think the other question I was going to ask, Chair, as well, is around our community hubs. So we have 5 community hubs, which are the amalgam of the old libraries and one-stop shops. I think what we're finding is that people increasingly are going to them for social interaction, to talk about problems, to talk about how they can invest in something, how they can participate, how they can volunteer. Just interested to hear your views. I think in terms of overcoming social isolation and loneliness, they are key places. And just, again, you know, very interested to hear how you think we may be able to take that model forward as an important place where people go to have their voices heard.
Sorry, back to Abergavenny again, but I think, you know, the one-stop shop, I would, you know, praise it, and I'm sure, you know, all the others that you have scattered around, and now we've got a hub coming, and that will be great. But I think as well, you perhaps got to think of having, although it might disperse it a bit, of having sort of little satellites going off that to areas where either because, say, somebody's old and not brilliantly mobile, or somebody, you know, if you've got 2 or 3 kids and you try to herd them onto the bus with a buggy and hang on to them, make sure they don't go under the wheels, etc. And it's raining, like today, you know, if you wanted to go into, say, Abergavenny or what Caldy got whatever today. So I think that sort of, you know, idea is a good one. But I think, picking up on what you just said now, in terms of housing, I think that's one of the most, you know, one of the single most important issues. In looking at those facts of an ageing population, less people, you know, under the age of 18, but less people under the age of 30, then if we're going to have a vibrant community, you've got to be in a place where you have housing that is affordable either via rent or to buy, because otherwise, and I certainly know from looking at people I've taught and my own children, they are going to live elsewhere where they can afford, and their skills and inputs will go elsewhere. And if you look at, you know, in the induction, you looked at the travel to work. I worked in Cardiff because of the nature of my job and the income that I had from that, which I wouldn't have had in Monmouthshire. But I wanted to live in Monmouthshire, and I commuted. But in some ways, it would have been better for people if you could afford housing, whether it is in the rented sector, you know, through housing associations, or encouraging, you know, private or joint ownership schemes. And at the end of the day, I think as an authority, we're going to have to bite the bullet in terms of making perhaps a fairly unpopular decision to build houses in particular areas. But that's what you've got to do, really. You know, and if you look at Germany or you look at Italy, they have much more emphasis on rented flats and apartments and houses, but you've got somewhere to live. And then when you say have children, or your needs change, your children have grown up, you want to downsize, you want to upsize, you can do that. But currently, talking to a lot of people, young people, sort of 18 to 30, a most of those are going to go and live in Blaenavon or Pontypool or whatever, because they just can't afford to buy anything here, or to even rent. Rent is expensive. So I think we've got to get away from that NIMBY sort of scenario and start to look at the very important issue of housing, to actually regenerate by keeping younger people here. And obviously it's linked with jobs, I know, but apart from that, if you haven't got a house or a flat to rent or buy, you're not going to stay in Monmouthshire.
Chair, if I can just make some suggestions for how we may keep this on the agenda and take it forward, if that's okay. Matt's mentioned Made Open as our digital platform, and it might be a good idea if we have some kind of active demonstration of that at the next meeting. And it might be, that we could put a challenge out, if anybody's listening, we're the Democratic Services Committee, or you as members of the Democratic Services Committee, how do you think we might best engage? There may be a bit of a live challenge or a question that we could put out on that platform via that demonstration. One of the developments that we're seeing now with the cabinet portfolios being crystallised is the creation of a community development office, which comes under Claire Marchant's brief. So it might be an idea to have some information on that, to understand what the community development office is going to look like, who's going to be out and active in your communities for you to be able to establish some contact with. And beyond that, it would be really interesting to know if there is a key theme or a number of key themes that you want to pursue. Is it the engagement of young people in particular? That seems to be quite a live issue, doesn't it? Lowering the voting age. Is it electronic voting and electronic sort of participation you're interested in? Is there one particular theme or issue that you'd like to keep on the agenda, aside from the demonstrations and maybe sticking a challenge out there and asking the community for views and an opinion? Is there one specific dimension or two or three that we've talked about today that you'd like to keep on the agenda, find out more about and potentially explore further?
Looking at your statistics, your pie chart, ages 26 to 39 being very slim. Now that's my age gap, I'm 31, and I'm appalled at how many people are actually engaging with you. Do you know, with the My Monmouthshire app, which I think is fantastic by the way, but it probably could do with some tweaking, what is the age category? What's the majority using it? Do we have that information to review? Because I think you could use something on the My Monmouthshire to engage with people and residents.
I think that's an excellent idea. I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but Abby was recounting them this morning, because we've got a product that does I want to say sensitivity analysis, but I'm thinking about business planning again. Sentiment analysis, that's the one, that is able to break down and to give us that information. So I can certainly get that for you, but again, it might be something you want to keep on the agenda. If we got 20,000 people signed up, how do we scale that up? Are there barriers to it being scaled up? Is it some of the tweaks that you were talking about? Could it be made more open and accessible? So it'd be good to focus on a couple of things that we can really show some progress has been made against over a period of months. That could be a really good one.
Following on from that, I think that is a good suggestion. It's good to have somebody, in that age group to represent that sort of view. But if you look at the advent of online banking, however many years ago, so many people now are obviously doing their online banking and all the other things that make it much easier to sort of manage your money and particularly to spend it. But people like Barclays, if you're having a problem, you can just pop in there and somebody, if you're older, you're not so familiar with IT, they'll take you through it, etc. And that then gets another customer logged on, and it means they're saving a little bit of, probably in the long term, labour cost, isn't it? That's what it means. And in reality, older people generally are not going to use something like an app, are they, as readily. I know there are plenty of older people who are using them, I'm not suggesting that, but I think for younger people, they lead busy lives, that's the way they operate, and that's the way you've got to get to them. You can't go back to the the penny black and say, well, write us a letter. People will want to email you or send you something on, put something out on Twitter or whatever, or WhatsApp and all the other different things. So I think we've got to think about that, and in reality, younger people are the sort of lifeblood of any community, aren't they? That successful communities are ones that manage to keep their young people with them and motivated and living in the area, that they're in a position to communicate, to contribute and go on to have children, etc., and sort of add to that.
Shall I just summarise that then in terms of for the next meeting then? So if we can have a live demonstration, Matt, of Made Open, and potentially you could chuck some questions out to whoever's listening or whoever wants to respond. Some more information on the Community Development Office and their priorities, and how that will impact you at a local level, and key contacts for you to establish. And then if we could focus in on something like the My Monmouthshire app and think about its reach, as Councillor Dimmock's helpfully suggested, and we can pull together some key stats, facts and figures, because that may give us an area where we can do a deeper dive and just explore the context and see what the potential is. Does that sound okay as a start of a 10? We can always expand and diversify, but it gives a point of focus, I think, doesn't it? Okay, great.
We got something to concentrate on, and that's what we want. We just don't want to be sitting here going through the motions, going through the agenda, and then saying bye bye. We need to be here for what we're here to do. It's the review of membership introduction process and feedback input.
Yes, Chair. This was just an item that I put on the agenda just to really try and get some information from you, in particular as new members, as to what you've thought about the induction process thus far, the bits that have been helpful, the bits that could have been made more helpful, to get really, any input, any contributions that you wanted to make. I'm aware that in the first few weeks, it is a bit like a baptism of fire, but you've had your first 2 council meetings, the AGM and the first advisory bodies and external appointments meeting. We've got first cabinet this week on Wednesday. I believe the select committees are starting as well now. Audit committee was last week, so many of you would have experienced the committee setting for the first time. But really, I think as we go along, it's really important to log and record any feedback, any input, any contributions, because we can keep iterating, we can keep nuancing and making sure that the process remains relevant for you and your needs as not just new members, but all members. I think there's always improvements that we can make. So really, this was just an open discussion item to get that feedback and to know if we can keep making those changes, which will, improve and enhance the experience for you. And importantly, going back to the point about democratic engagement, make sure you're getting the relevant information out to your constituents and your electorate as well. So it's over to you.
Firstly, I've actually really quite enjoyed the induction process. The one thing that was a big shock was in advance of being elected, you sent out a piece of paper saying there's going to be these training sessions. It wasn't complete, and some of the timings changed, and I'm a mother with a preschooler. So my nursery has been really, really kind and they have jiggled things around, but it has actually been quite an issue for me trying to figure out the childcare arrangements for this whole period. I wasn't expecting as many training sessions, and I'm trying to get to as much as possible because I do really value the input I'm getting. But in advance for 5 years' time, more information in advance as to what you might be encountering would be really helpful.
Do you think there may be other ways that we could deliver some of that training? Do you think, given your experience, has it required you to actually, has the face-to-face bit been important? Are there other aspects of that we could have delivered perhaps differently?
Yeah, you could have I'm the sort of person who can definitely take things on board in writing, so I can actually sit and read a lot, and I don't have any problem absorbing large amounts of written information. So some of the sessions I could have had you just the briefing information, the slideshows, and I would have probably been fine to take those on board. Also things like having a full day rather than it's 2 hours of this and then another day I have to drive all the way to Usk and 2 hours for this. So it's a 35-minute drive each way, and that's obviously an extra hour and a half of childcare that I have to pay for. It's just extras. The other thing that's a slight negative is I believe the training for how to claim expenses is on Thursday, which is the date of the deadline for submitting expenses. So it's too late, yeah. But I have thoroughly enjoyed the induction period so far.
On that, obviously, I did enjoy all the training. I think you've done a fantastic job. Is there any way we can Skype, so we can actually Skype in? You know, I've got a full-time job. I'm a property manager. Things go wrong. I'm stuck. I need to be in the building. So it'd be wonderful if we had the facilities so we could actually Skype into training. I think that would be fantastic. I think you'd actually have more people engaging in them than ever.
Do you have, you know, on the new, you have Skype running on that, you do, right? It is installed and it is working, right? Okay, well, I don't see why we couldn't stream those and people could dial in via Skype. Which sounds like a very easy thing to do. Perhaps I'm missing the blindingly obvious, but yeah, we can certainly do that. Yeah.
We're testing some new equipment, aren't we? So the meeting rooms around the building have had some kitting over the past couple of years, which hasn't been the most effective in terms of its integration with Skype. But our digital office are trialling a new system in one of the meeting rooms downstairs. And you know, hopefully if that's going well, that will give us the solution to enable to Skype in. Yeah. Because if it's just a fixed camera, it's very hard to feel like you're part of the session. You do need a sort of tracking camera and some good quality microphones to hear the whole thing. It's not as simple as just plugging one laptop in the corner. I've been as part of meetings like that, and you do tend to get a little bit forgotten about.
I'd agree with the two councillors who've spoken, you know, already, and I think particularly if you've got young children, difficult, and if you've got a full-time job of trying to match it in, and in that sense you want to try and have a process that involves people from different sectors. I've finished working and therefore it is more manageable. I would agree with the point about having these sort of small slots. In some ways, even if you haven't got the pull of young kids or full-time work, actually, say a full day, you know, is better. You know, just to sort of manage your time. I would say, personally, I've found most of the training has been really good, and it's difficult in the sense that you're trying to balance the thing of Skyping in. I think that's a good idea, but I think sometimes it has been good to actually meet people and say, well, you know, that's so and so, that's the officer for so and so, that, you know, that's the leader, that, you know, etc., etc. I think it reminds me a little bit of being catapulted in, and it's like about being back in year 7, isn't it? Because certainly, unless you're in an established seat where, within reason, you know you're going to win, then for lots of us, perhaps we weren't fully prepared. You know, I don't know whether I was really, but all jokes aside, I think being given the folder on the night that you were elected, I was a bit taken aback at that. But it was useful, but. It did start then with a bit of a force, and it's got to in reality. But I think we could have some sessions that, you know, I work for the exam board. We used sort of train sessions with teachers where yes, it was live streamed and you could ask questions, but it's got to be good enough that you feel part of it and you can ask a question and you don't just sit there as if you're watching daytime TV. You know, it's you know, you've got to be part of it, haven't you? You know, it's quite the word escapes me at the moment what they actually call these sessions, but you know, where it is interactive. But yeah, but on the other hand, I think hopefully I can absorb stuff, but I do think it's useful to be sort of told, You know, I think that's the thing. And I would agree, the thing about expenses, all that sort of nitty-gritty stuff, I think that could have been done earlier, and the giving of a number, etc. Because at the end of the day, for most of us, then you've got to outlay money in fuel or bus fares or whatever to get here, and you should be in a means then to obviously claim that back.
Yes, I think the training overall has been really good. It's been very well thought out, and what has come over loud and clear is explaining to us how the council operates and the various departments. I think it would be very useful for this question to be asked of all the new members, because obviously people will have different views on their own experiences. The IT training, I think, has been quite good, because they haven't been filling us up with too much in one go, because there's a lot to absorb with that. The only thing I would have liked to have seen, and it's a very basic thing, is it would have been nice to have had a tour of the building on the first day and to meet the officers in the various departments. But I mean, that's a small thing, I know. But I think, as I said earlier, the overall training has been well thought out, and we've been taking things in gradually, which is helpful too.
One of the issues that I picked up, Chair, I think it was on one of the first induction sessions, was having some orientation for casework. So, for example, if you get a resident who's asking about a pothole, the relevant officer and department highways may not mean anything to you. Is that in place now? Have you got those key contacts and those? Right, okay. So we still need to get that right. Because it's very difficult sometimes, isn't it, to even know the department to locate it with, let alone the key individual. So I thought if we just got you key individuals and what they do, not their departmental name, that might just give you a point of contact easily for casework, for you to be able to handle and process local casework. So, okay, all right. Sorry, Chair, do you have any feedback?
No. I think you've covered everything well, and I think the councillors have asked good and sensible questions, and it's enough to take on board for you and Matt to come back and address us at the next meeting. But the one thing I was going to say, items for further work program is, I've noticed, and I've had complaints, if you want, about the new equipment we've got. Some of it's not working properly, some of it's cutting out, and it's not adaptable to the equipment we've already had from Monmouthshire County Council, hence printers. I tried to plug mine in to the printer, and it said this is not connected up. And at home, sometimes I can get the hub, and then sometimes I can't. So I think that should be on the agenda. It's given the authorities enough time to sort out any problems, which has been happening. But anybody got anything else they would like to see go on the agenda? No? Right then. Thank you very much. And to note, the date of the next meeting is the 4th of September. I honestly think, although it was reduced last year to 4 times a year, I think it's too far apart, the meetings, and I think it's something we should discuss at our next meeting, because people do lose interest, and they just lose track of what was discussed from the meeting before, although it's printed. Right, thank you very much. Good drive home, safely drive home.